The future of this multi-generational society is when we're older and younger people can connect, collaborate, contribute together in some of the areas like school, work, housing, and it's forcing us to think not just about the new length of life, but a new map of life. The next gen is CoGen.
Welcome to the Midlife Chrysalis podcast with Chip Conley, where we explore how midlife isn't a crisis, but a chrysalis, a time of profound transformation that can lead to the most meaningful chapter of your life.
Well, hello. It is another episode of the Midlife Chrysalis, and I'm Chip Conley. And I have trotted into this episode Marc Freedman. Marc is like my modern elder. He is the wisest person I know in the world around policies and practices that can create more intergenerational collaboration. He started something called Encore.org, which actually popularized the idea of Encore careers. And then his primary focus today is on intergenerational collaboration. I love the guy. He is the one who helped me to see that I'm a mentor and an intern at the same time. And that's what I did at Airbnb with the young founders. I think you're going to find this to be both an interesting episode when it comes to the sort of history of aging and longevity and ageism and age segregation, what is also called age apartheid. But I think it's also interesting from the perspective of practical tools and tips for how we can actually feel a sense of relevance and not worry about being youthful, but instead being useful. I hope you enjoy the episode. All right, Marc Freedman, you are my modern elder. So, quick story. When I was, in my mid to later 50s and was at Airbnb and endeavoring to write a book called Wisdom at Work, The Making of a Modern Elder, I decided to go out and talk to people who knew a lot more about aging and midlife and Encore careers and things like that, a term that you and the Encore.org organization popularized. I came to the Presidio and you and I sat outside, I remembered, and just talked about aging and the history of aging and why we are an ageist society. And my God, in an hour or two of time, I felt like this is my librarian. So will you give us a little bit of your perspective on how we have evolved in the United States into a place where aging used to be something people aspired to now being something that people are afraid of?
It's a full circle feeling around these trepidations, because we started living longer in the 20th century. As you and others have pointed out, life expectancy was 46, 47 in 1900, and then we started adding years to life. And by the middle of the century, we had added these years to life, but we couldn't figure out what to do with them. In fact, Walter Reuther, the great UAW leader, got up in front of his union in Milwaukee in 1948 and described retirement as too old to work, too young to die. 5 years later, Louis Mumford, the New Yorker's architectural critic who had just turned 60 himself, and who, as it turns out, was in the midst of his midlife chrysalis. He'd win the National Book Award in his 70s in over a decade. But he said at no point in any society had any group been so rejected as older people today. And even the experts, the gerontologists, were saying that older people should stay out of the way, rock aimlessly on their porch, have a Whistler's mother-like existence. And that turned out to be a real problem. People dreaded that period.
What happened between the late 19th century and the 1950s that led to older people no longer having a voice?
It was a cultural problem. We really hadn't conceptualized a period beyond midlife, beyond the 50s, and that's partly because we've never had that period for very long. But it's It's interesting to note that in the United States, there's some irony because when the Puritans came over here in the 1600s and 1700s, they loved old people because if you live to a ripe old age, first of all, there were very few older people, but if you lived to a ripe old age, it was seen as a sign from the divine that you were closer to God, that you were chosen. And so the Puritans, unlike anything we've seen for hundreds of years, they tried to be or at least appear older than they were. They wore white wigs. They lied on the census and they said they were older than they actually were 3 years on average. They even had specially trained tailors who could cut people's clothes so they looked hunched over.
Oh, really? Oh
And
my
instead of being a Jew from Eastern Europe, I should have been a Mayflower Puritan because I've got the right posture for Puritanism. But so we started out in it as a what people called a gerontocracy. We revered older people. That changed, as you were saying, over time. And in the 19th century, older people were fully integrated in society. In fact, all ages were. We lived together in multi-generational households. We worked together in farms and the agrarian economy, older and younger people together. Even the one-room schoolhouse of yore had 4-year-olds and 50-year-olds learning their ABCs side by side. In fact, we became an age-oblivious society in which people did not even know how old they were. Knowing somebody's age would be like knowing somebody's blood type today. I'm sure you'd be put off if I asked, "Hey, Chip, what blood type are you, by the way? I've been meaning to ask you."
I to be honest, I don't even remember, but that reminds me of the Satchel Paige quote, which is the famous pitcher who actually entered the major leagues in baseball at around 47 or 48 years old and pitched into his 60s. And he said, "What age would you be if you didn't know what age you were?" Which is such a great question.
Well, we're re-entering that period. There are all these at least 40 something as LeBron James turns 40. I knew we would find some way to get sports into our conversation, Chip.
So we moved from this era where aging was aspirational to this era where aging was a negative thing. Even though one of the most powerful lobbyists out there was AARP, and retirement communities started to pop up. Actually, talk a little bit about Sun City and you've written about it in your books and articles. You know the history of retirement communities better than just about anybody I know.
Yeah, for me, the interest in this history came from very practical reasons. I was trying to mobilize older people to get involved in their communities, to use their wisdom and experience for the greater good. And, it was going against the grain. Graying as playing has long been the ideal, even before Jimmy Buffett created his lifestyle communities. But it turns out that, and I was very critical of retirement communities, which I think played the decisive role in transforming American culture around later life. Only 5% of the population ever moved to places like Sun City, but they really reshaped the culture, and they came in where a huge opportunity existed. Who wants to be too old to work, too young to die? That's not something that you aspire to. And especially as that period became increasingly protracted, it was a difficult period for older people. I now believe that the retirement community entrepreneurs really did us service in the context that they worked in. So the first retirement community was a place in Peoria, Arizona, with just 100 houses, started by a real estate broker named Big Ben Schleifer, who was a socialist. He was trying to create a kibbutz in the middle of the desert because he had a friend in upstate New York who was withering away in a nursing home, an older friend, and he was appalled by that. So he came back to Arizona where he was living and decided he would create essentially a utopian community for all these older people who were thrown to the sidelines of society. And the same year he opened his utopian community, Louis Mumford, who I mentioned earlier, wrote an article in Architectural Digest and said, we've got to do two things to save older people in this country. The first is to avoid at all costs making them into children, infantilizing them. And the second is to keep them embedded in the mainstream of society. The article was titled "For Older People, Not Segregation, Integration." That same year, Big Ben Schleifer opened his retirement community and did exactly the opposite of it. It was age segregated, and it was called Youngtown. It was a chance to be young again. Rather than a midlife chrysalis, it was a reboot. And the key ingredient was to make sure there were no children to burst the bubble of a second child. So there were actually no real children. And Youngtown became famous later on because they were expelling a couple, this is in the 1990s, for harboring their grandchildren. It was like the Scarlet Letter. There was a big sign planted on their lawn. The New York Times pointed out that dogs were allowed at Youngtown, but not children. And Del Webb was so inspired by what he saw going on in Youngtown, which got a lot of media attention, that directly across the street, he opened the first large retirement community, Sun City, on January 1st, 1960. And, here's another sports analogy. If you build it, they will come. Well, Webb built it, and 100,000 people showed up on January 1st, 1960. Older people all around the country who didn't want to be the most rejected group in history. They didn't want to be too old to work, too young to die. They wanted to be a place where they could forget they were old, but also to have community. As Sun City took off, Leisure World, others, followed in its footsteps. And even in the last census, the villages in Florida, famously a conservative retirement community, was designated by the Census Bureau as the fastest growing metropolitan area in America.
And also the fastest growing sexually transmitted diseases county in America as well, surprisingly.
Talk about trying to redefine the culture of aging. But on the
Yeah.
culture point, I didn't want to forget to add this. Del Webb was the person who not only built it, but he named it. He invented the phrase "the golden years," and that became the aspirational ideal for later life. So instead of being the most rejected people in society, people actually tried to retire earlier. It wasn't retiring at 65, but it was retiring at 60 or 55. And Webb's genius also was that he democratized retirement. He created these Sun Cities, which were like Levittown. They were very affordable. Working class Americans who belonged to unions like the UAW could go there, and they could they could have a new life. So it was a kind of midlife chrysalis.
And so, Mark, that led to, over the course of the 80s and the 1990s, the retirement age dropping down to, I think it may, at its lowest point, it might have gotten to about 57 in the year 2000. And it's been creeping up since then. I think the average retirement age today is 61 or 62 in the US. Is that because people are, by choice or by necessity, feeling like they want to stay in the workplace longer? And how much of this relates to knowledge workers versus people breaking their backs? I think Studs Terkel, in his book, Working, or whatever the name of that book was called,
Yes,
was
yeah.
he talked about the fact that, yes, if you've been doing mind-numbing, back-breaking labor at age 60 years old, you don't want to do it anymore. Retirement is something you want some leisure from, but for a lot of us today, the idea of retirement is like a dirty word.
Yeah. Well, first of all, it's you're making me think about maybe a decade ago. I heard Studs Terkel at 90 address the Gerontological Society of America, and he got up in front of thousands of gerontologists and spoke for an hour with no notes, without pause, in gripping fashion. And I kind of think if he was around today, he'd probably write a new book called Still Working. But the whole idea of 65 as as retirement was an arbitrary number. You know, it was based, at least some people think, on Otto von Bismarck's age for retirement from the Prussian military, convinced that they would never pay out a pension. This is in the late 19th century. Of course, Bismarck was, I think, 78 at the time, but he didn't consider himself part of the rabble. But John Chauvin at Stanford, the economist, has argued that we would never use $1935 in 2025 without adjusting them for inflation. But we set 65 as the retirement age in 1935 in arbitrary fashion. And it became this great point of demarcation. But I think people are starting to question that now. I think we're realizing that all these extra years that have been added, 3 decades or more, depending on what country you're looking at, they're not being, as Laura Carstensen points out, tacked on at the end. They're being added throughout the life course, and it's forcing us to think not just about the new length of life, but a new map of life.
Let's talk about you for a second. You're
No,
65.
I
I know you
hate
don't
to
like
talk
talking
about
about yourself.
myself.
Let's talk about history. No, no. So Mark, you're 65. Is you're 66?
67.
What's your relationship with retirement like? I mean, what is and in the abstract, I'm not talking about like when are you going to leave your job as the co-CEO of CoGenerate.org, and it used to be called Encore.org. But what's the Marc Freedman feeling about retirement, and how does that influence your behavior?
I spent the last 30, 40 years railing against retirement, all of its deleterious effects on health and well-being of individuals and society, which is throwing away the most experienced segment of population. And now I'm 67 and all my friends are retiring and they seem to be having a great time. And I'm working away. And I think I've been struck by two things. One is after all these decades of pontificating, I wasn't really talking about myself. I was talking about you, what you should do. And it's been a little bit of a challenge to assimilate personally all of this so-called wisdom that's been being put out. But the second thing I think is that it's making me realize that one statistic that I saw years ago and that I think continues to be true is what is often characterized as retirement is really a sabbatical. People have reached a point where they need rest. They need a reset. It's a transition more than a destination. And I suspect many of my friends and colleagues who think they're at a destination will actually be at a transition. And there's research from Rand Corporation that shows that most people who retire unretire. But I wouldn't mind retiring for a little bit. I just finished a year in which I was doing my role at CoGenerate and also starting a new midlife wisdom like program at Yale, the Experienced Leaders Initiative. And at 67, if you're not Chip Conley, it's hard to do two jobs at once. I know you've been doing about four, but that was exhausting. And I've been trying to get back on my feet ever since.
So talk a little bit about Encore Careers and the origin story of Encore.org, which is now called CoGenerate.org. Talk about the evolution. In fact, there are three names, if I'm not mistaken, not just two. Give us the origin story of Civic Ventures and Encore.org and then CoGenerate.org, and what changed along the way for you to change the name. I think your name changes really speak to not just Mark's interests, but what society needs.
One might characterize that as an identity crisis if it was an individual, but there is an evolution. And it's making me want to go back and talk very quickly about a study we did when we shifted into being Encore.org, because it goes to your previous question about people working longer. We asked Americans over 50 whether they wanted to have an encore career, a second act for the greater good. And it was a time when Jimmy Carter was very much in the news and other Bill Gates, prominent people who were having these second acts. And we found that 4.5 million older Americans were already in an Encore career, essentially a 10-year career that wasn't as long as midlife in duration, but weighed as much. And 21 million more said it was their top priority to do that. And if you add those two up, you get 25.5 million people, and the average length of time that they planned on an Encore career was a decade. So that's 250 million years of human and social capital to be working on some of the most. And what we heard over and over again is that the problem was the transition. It was a do it yourself process, getting from what's last to what's next, which is why things like the Modern Elder Academy are so important. People don't have a but our start as an organization was focused on young people. I was involved in the first study that had been done of Big Brothers Big Sisters, which showed that these mentors had a huge impact on kids' lives. And I read a quote around that time from the great psychologist Yuri Bronfenbrenner, who started the Head Start program. He said, "What every child needs is at least one adult who's irrationally crazy about them." So I decided to get into the business of finding irrationally crazy adults who were interested in mentoring kids, because the Big Brothers Big Sisters program was having a huge impact, but they had more kids on the waiting list than in the program, and they were recruiting the busiest people in society who were in their 20s, 30s, 40s, didn't have enough time to spend with their own kids, much less, 10 hours a month with somebody else's child. It seemed at that point that the answer was in the older population. So I was kind of a young person focused on young people, but came to older people as a solution. And at that point, we were hearing the older population was set to double. People were watching a lot of Gilligan's Island on TV. So, along with Linda Fried, who was at Johns Hopkins Medical School then, and John Gardner, who was a remarkable social entrepreneur, who was the person who implemented Medicare, we created Experience Core to be an answer to that do it yourself problem. A national core that was summoning older people to use their accumulated wisdom and experience to help the next generation thrive. And it was funny, I remember in the early days of interviewing experience core members around the country, they'd asked me about the name, and I said, well, it's to honor all of this time and experience that you had. And they thought it was a program you went to have experiences. So I realized we were onto something, but the Experience Corps members never left. They stayed 10 years in the program. They weren't like Peace Corps volunteers or Teach for America volunteers who were passing through en route to something else. And so they were the first kind of embodiment of the Encore career idea. So we changed our name from Civic Ventures to Encore.org. Spent about 15 years promoting this idea of second acts for the greater good at the intersection of passion, purpose, and a paycheck. We created the Purpose Prize to honor people over the age of 60 who were doing their most significant and creative work, and the Encore Fellows program to become a pathway to purpose. But after 15 years of doing that, we decided to go back to our origins of bringing generations together, but in a different way. I think the original idea behind Experience Core is you owe future generations your time and talent. And today, I think we're convinced that it's not just what older or younger people can do for each other, but it's what they can do together with each other. So co is the Latin word for together, and so we adopted this new name as a guidepost as we try to bring the generations together at a moment when a quarter of the population is under 20 and a quarter of the population is over 60. And so we think there's a great opportunity in that kind of connection and collaboration.
Tell us a little bit more about what CoGenerate does and where are the bamboo shoots out in society, maybe whether it's in music or in other parts of society where you're seeing like, hey, we are moving away from age apartheid. We are actually learning how to connect the generations again. Tell us a little bit more about how we might have some hopefulness about this.
Yeah, well, I really think that we've always, as human beings, lived in co-generational settings. In fact, anthropologists now think that we became human beings because of the role that grandparents played taking care of young children in the hunter-gatherer period of humanity, and that allowed both parents to go out and hunt and gather, get lots of food, and enable the long, helpless period that human babies have, which allow us to grow these big brains. So essentially, you could argue that grandmothers made us human in the first place. And so I think one of our challenges is to first recognize that the last century's been an aberration, a radical reshuffling of society by age, overvaluing peer contact over cross generational contact. And we have the weight of thousands and thousands of years of human behavior moving us back together again. And I think that's really what's happening is we're seeing all throughout society this desire to come together across age, despite the kids versus canes rhetoric that we're hearing. And there have always been generational tensions, but there's been a fourfold increase in multi-generational housing in recent decades. We're seeing a cultural revolution. You've talked a lot about the hero's journey, where shows like Hacks and Only Murders in the Building and Reservation Dogs, and more they throw older people together. They require them to save each other, and in the process, they fall in love. Music, which you mentioned earlier, is is lighting this path as well. It's been one national phenomenon after the other, the first being Lady Gaga and Tony Bennett, but the Grammys last year were swept away by Tracy Chapman and Luke Combs. Luke Combs wasn't even born when Tracy Chapman had a hit with Fast Car, the duet they did together, Joni Mitchell and Brandy Carlisle. I could go on and on. In the 50th anniversary recently of Saturday Night Live, Sabrina Carpenter and Paul Simon did Homeward Bound, and Sabrina Carpenter pointed out that she wasn't alive when Paul Simon first did that on Saturday Night Live, and then she added that her parents weren't even alive. But there's a way in which I think there's a deep inchoate yearning to come across to connect across generational lines. And it's not just young people who need irrational love from older people, but I think those of us in our 60s and 70s and beyond have a similar need. The Harvard study of adult development showed that older people who connect and collaborate with younger people are 3 times as likely to be happy as those who fail to do so.
So, what does CoGenerate do to help this important trend?
I'm glad you asked me, and twice, so I would actually answer your question. There's been a lot of appreciation of the power of social capital, really, ever since Robert Putnam's book, Bowling Alone. And I think there's a unique aspect to social capital that's cross generational. And the way to think of it is peer parent relationships are different than grandparent grandchild relationships. It's part of this essential portfolio of the human experience, and we've lost that over the last century. And the reason we lost it is that we created a whole set of societal institutions which kept people of different ages with their peers. So in the beginning of the 20th century, we invented child labor laws and universal schooling. So young people were gathered with other young people. We enforced mandatory retirement. Even Social Security was designed to get older people out of the workplace at a time during the Depression when we had huge unemployment. And then one after another, with absolute brilliance, we invented not only retirement communities, senior centers, nursing homes, lifelong learning programs that were just for older people, and the generational twain stopped meeting. And the problem was a lack of infrastructure. There's a sociologist at NYU who wrote a book called Palaces for the People about Andrew Carnegie and the invention of libraries. But he uses it as a way to show how we need institutions in society, places, concrete places that can be meeting grounds. And so what civic Ventures turned Encore.org turned CoGenerate is trying to do is to create places in society where the generations can meet, and it's all built around the idea of proximity, purpose, and partnership. My second 3P alliteration. But we older and younger people need places where they can be near each other, physically proximate. They need to be near o people of different generations who have the same priorities that they do, and they need opportunities to do things together. And so we're working in a whole set of places where we feel like those connections are most potentially promising. One area is higher education, which has really reinforced age segregation in society, but has enormous opportunities to turn that around. Another area is faith institutions. You know, what institution in society is more tied to the cycle of life than religious institutions? And yet oftentimes they're highly segregated by age. Music is another realm. We're launching a project called Generations Got Talent, which is trying to bring the Brandy Carlisle, Joni Mitchell magic to local communities where older and younger people, in duets and in a variety of genres of music, end up showing what the generations can do together. One of the most prominent areas we're trying to advance is around service. National service in America, which is currently under attack, has always been deeply divided by age. AmeriCorps members are almost entirely under 25, and AmeriCorps senior members are over the age of 60. So you got people in communities who are working on the same issues and the same buildings, you know, down the hall from each other, but separated by age. We just believe that older and younger people can do together what neither can do on their own.
A macro question and then a micro question. The macro question is, if you were hired by the White House, forget about the administration, this or another administration, to curate socially a program or a policy that would help to connect people across generations, what is, you can come up with more than one if you want, but what would you recommend to the president of the United States?
Well, I think we need a set of big ideas, but I'll start out, I mentioned higher education and what we could do to bring older people back to campus, inspired by programs like Harvard Advanced Leadership Initiative, Stanford's Distinguished Careers Initiative, where older people are infiltrating classrooms with younger people, and there's an extraordinary interaction that's happening in those classrooms, but it's on a small scale and at a very elite level. What if we gave people an early year of Social Security in to go back to school in return for working an actuarially adjusted period later? It would be like a GI Bill for older people moving into education that acknowledges the new length of life and the fact that you can't shoehorn all your education in, up to age 25 and then expect it to last for 75 years. But it would create training grounds for people to learn how to thrive in a multi-generational world. Older people, younger people. So that's one idea. Another idea is that older people in America have 54 million spare bedrooms in their house, and we're just beginning to
I
explore.
think Airbnb knows that one. But
Yeah,
go ahead.
yes. Absolutely. There's a phenomenal program called Nesterly that was started by two 20-somethings at MIT in their city planning program, which is creating opportunities for grad students in areas where rent is extremely high to live with older people who have space, but oftentimes need help with chores or even a modest rent. And so it turns out that that effort, and I've seen this over and over again, efficiency leads to humanity. They come together because one party needs chores and some rent, the other party needs affordable housing, but relationships bloom in that context. And I've seen that over and over again. I went to a place in Cleveland called Judson Manor, where it's a senior living facility. It's in some ways kind of the ideal 21st century senior living community, across the street from the Symphony and Case Western University, all these learning opportunities. And behind it is the Cleveland Clinic with all kinds of health care benefits. They decided they love music so much that they would have graduate students in music come live amidst the elders in Judson. I showed up on a November day, and there were 35 Swedish social scientists who'd come to Cleveland in the middle of the winter to learn about what was happening in Judson. So when the Scandinavians are showing up in the Rust Belt, you know something good's happening. And these graduate students in music were living next to older people, proximity. They had shared interests in music, purpose. I met a 93-year-old woman named Carla who lived next to a young violist who married another young violist. They didn't invite Carla to the wedding. They asked her to be the maid of honor. So efficiency and humanity, quickly blend together. And so that's a second idea. What about housing? How do we age integrate housing, whether it's through the 54 million spare bedrooms or all of the opportunities for older and younger people to come together and live near each other? Another idea, the grandparent notion. I've really been interested in how do you create fictive grandparents? And there are efforts all over the world to connect unrelated older and younger people in ways that do produce these powerful grandparent-like relationships. We've heard more and more in recent years about the friendship bench in Zimbabwe and now elsewhere, where Dixon Chibende has created these spaces where grandmothers can use their wisdom to help particularly young mothers. Finland has a community grandparent program. Even in tiny-ish Finland, so many grandparents and grandchildren aren't living near each other to create these community grandparent relationships. So that's a third idea. What about a new rite of passage where older and younger people did a year of service together? And I think I'm a kind of John Dewey devotee at root, because I think it's the through the do. If you put two people in a room and tell them to relate, I think you're going to get mixed results. But if they're working on something they both care about, I think that becomes the scaffolding around which these bonds can form.
So now the micro question is that you've sort of helped to set the table policy wise and what we want to see sort of societally. But let's say someone's listening or watching this right now and they're maybe late 50s and they're considering retirement and a little bit scared of that because like there's this big gaping hole in their life. And as Ken Dykewald, who I think you're having lunch with today, has shown, there's a people trade their work for the TV. So the average American retiree a few years ago was clocked to watch 47 hours of TV a week. What do you recommend? What are some tips, some personal tips that a person could take into account in looking at how they're going to curate their life, either post retirement or even while they're still working? One of the big trends we see is back in the old days, you were working 100% on a Friday and 0% on a Monday. But now we have things like the portfolio life where people move from one job on a Friday to actually over the next few months having two or three different ways of working, maybe some volunteer wise, but some they make money. What would you recommend to somebody who's sort of a little bit lost and they don't know what resources they have available to them?
I'm glad you brought up the point about people starting while they're still working. So I would suggest a few different things. One is to lean into the question of time that we've been talking about since the beginning of this is a long distance race, that if you are leaving your midlife chapter or your first part of your midlife chapter in at 50, as you and others have pointed out, you probably have at least half of adulthood in front of you. There's an abundance of time at this point, so you can take a break. You can have a gap year. I've long thought that gap years for grown-ups were just as needed as gap years for young people, right? I mean, who people have been spending 20, 30, 40 years working, raising kids, doing caregiving. They need some time to take a step back and rest up and ready themselves for the next chapter. So that's the first thing, is to get the time right and to except, young people will, in many cases, go to college at 18, graduate school, they, spend maybe 7 years in that chapter, and now we know that emerging adulthood is a new chapter in the 20s, so they get some spaciousness to navigate from being a somewhat dependent to somewhat independent person. I think people in midlife need more spaciousness, maybe not 15 years, but more than the weekend in between finishing one job and starting a new chapter. So get the time right. The second, I think, is to really try to find a some structured context to do this kind of exploration, right? I've been very taken with MEA's idea of disrobing in midlife. And that doesn't happen overnight. As mentioned earlier, I just finished being the faculty director for the inaugural cohort of the Yale Experience Leaders Initiative. And the people who came into that program, uh,
which is at Yale, which
it,
is at Yale University. Yep.
yes, at the Yale School of Management. And we had 3 pillars that were sequential for the program. They really mirror MEAs. They're essentially wisdom, purpose, and transitions. We call them looking inward, looking outward, and moving forward. And one of the things I discovered is many of the fellows needed 6 months just to look inward. They weren't ready to move forward, and so I think getting, again, acknowledging this length of time that's necessary, that it's a fitful process and it's also an experimental process. I think, very rarely do people reinvent themselves. We hear these stories of, somebody opening a vineyard or a B&B and the clouds part and the birds sing and, nobody ever breaks a sweat. But really, I think it's an experimental process, which is also something that takes time. So I would say acknowledge the time question, but also try things on. And we need more opportunities for people to do that and try things on in a structured context. We created the Encore Fellowships program over a decade ago as essentially an internship for grown-ups. That gap year that we talked about earlier, where people could get inside an organization, use their accumulated skills, but in new ways that were and I think this is really important, to find opportunities to do that where you're comfortable because you're using skills and experience, that your experience matters, but in new settings towards new ends in new ways. And so it's a mix of comfort and adventure. And it's really in many ways reintegration more than reinvention, where people are taking pieces of their life and putting them together in new ways that feel fresh and compelling. And then I would say that maybe the third thing is to think about the time beyond our lives. You've talked a lot, I have as well, about Erik Erikson's famous quote that the hallmark of successful development in later life is "I am what survives of me." But I think the operational version of that is to do things together with young people. And I saw that in the Encore Fellows program. It wasn't part of the design of the program. People would go and work in an NGO. Maybe they were a marketing person at Oracle. They're doing marketing for a social impact organization. But these bonds form between these modern elders and young leaders in the organization that were very rich. And so it was a soil around. So I would say find settings where, young people are gonna be in your path.
So, Mark, you have taught at MEA in Baja before, an intergenerational workshop. And this fall in November, you and I will be co-leading a workshop at our Santa Fe campus. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? And like, why would somebody even want to come to this? And what practically will they get out of this experience?
Well, I feel like the real fountain of youth is the fountain with youth, that we've lost the skills of being generative because society has pushed us into different corners, people of different ages, and being a modern elder, is so linked to being generative. And so I think we need to come up with strategies and skills and practice working with other generations to do that well. And now we're at the doorstep of the most age diverse moment in not only American history, but world history. We have the same number of people alive at every age from 0 to 75, give or take small numbers. So the old demographic inverted pyramid where you get a lot of people who are young and very few who are small is now a flat line. And so we're entering an era in which learning to work across generational lines is essential to thrive as a society. But we need places to think about, to take a step back, to figure out how to do that, especially because there aren't enough opportunities in our age segregated, age apartheid world, to make that happen naturally.
So in the workshop, people will learn, is the workshop oriented toward a variety of ages, and is it learning how to find your way in a more age diverse world? One of the interesting stats that I find fascinating, it has changed over time, is the US Department of Labor now says by the year 2027, it used to be 2025, by the year 2027, they believe that the majority of Americans will have a younger boss. Now, we've never seen that before. We've always had this sort of age hierarchy. The older you are, the higher you are on the org chart. My experience at Airbnb, both being the mentor to Brian Chesky, who is the CEO and co-founder, but also having him be my boss. My boss was my mentee, was a fascinating experience. And I wish I'd had a class like the class we're going to be teaching to help people to understand, how do you create a deeper level respect, a deeper level of understanding? How do you create mentorship, mutual mentorship? So, this is in many ways a workshop around how to be a mutual mentor, but I want you to add to that.
Well, part of it is about how to become a mutual mentor and really how to collaborate with younger generations, not just to impart your vast wisdom or to learn how to use technology from them. And there's so much evidence that when older and younger come together, they can do remarkable things. We both talked about the BMW study, which had three assembly lines, one of younger workers, one of older, and a mixed line, and the mixed line far outperformed the other two. Arthur Brooks, who's been on the MEA faculty, talks about fluid and crystallized intelligence, young people being particularly strong on fluid intelligence, older people on crystallized intelligence, and argues that no workplace should be without both. And I think that the future of this multi-generational society is not just in helping each other out, but collaborating on equal footing. So we'll learn the skills of doing that kind of collaboration and the mindset, but we'll also talk about some of the creative settings that are being developed where that can happen, where older and younger people can connect, collaborate, contribute together in some of the areas, like school, work, housing, care. So this will be both a skill building opportunity, but also a wayfinding guidance.
My last question for you, Mark, is, imagine a younger person comes to you and says, "Hey, Mark, I'd love to have tea or coffee with you next week. And I would love to have you to come to the meeting with a bumper sticker, a wisdom bumper sticker, something you've learned along the way that has Marc Freedman's wisdom fingerprints all over it." What would be your life lesson or wisdom that you might offer to that person personally, professionally, whatever? And what's the origin story for that wisdom?
It's making me think of my hero was Maggie Kuhn, who was about 4
Explain who she is. Yes.
yeah,
Yes.
4'10". She was the founder of the Grey Panthers, movement. She was a inveterate rabble rouser. She lived in a big multi-generational house in the Germantown section of Philadelphia, and when she died, on her gravestone in my hometown of Philadelphia, and I visited the gravestone, it says, "Here lies Maggie Kuhn under the only stone she left unturned." So I think that's, yeah, the kinda grave, stone that we should all aspire to. When I think about myself, I often think of a quote, a Greek proverb: "Society grows great when older people plant trees under whose shade they shall never sit." And so maybe something that says he planted trees, under whose shade he never sit, but I ideally planted those trees with somebody younger. We have a young impact fellow at CoGenerate, though, who I think has come up with something even better, which, maybe I'll appropriate and attribute to her, Ariel Galinsky. She says, "The next gen is cogen." Maybe I'll add that one on the other side.
And last thought is, how do you measure your success, Mark? I mean, you've been, you're a norm entrepreneur, a term that I didn't even know, which was an entrepreneur, a social innovator who helps change norms. You've been an amazing author. I love your books. You've helped to help people to see that they can, make a difference at any age of life, and even better across generations. How do you measure that, other than to feel a little tingly inside when someone comes to you and says, like, "Mark, you changed my life."
The chance to work with you, Chip, and with other remarkable innovators has been the great joy of my life. But it was interesting in contemplating our conversation, because I knew you'd ask me to say something beyond just the usual sound bites, and I think really, my whole life, not just work, but my whole life has really been around the idea of connection. E.M. Forster's great line, maybe this is what should be on the gravestone, was "Only connect." And
Yeah, yeah.
that's really what drew me to bringing older and younger people together. It was out of this belief in love, and that there was a special kind of cross-generational love. It's funny, at the time that I was focused on that initially, even going back to this mentoring work and Big Brothers Big Sisters, all the experts were saying that that was an externality that needed to be shoved off to the sidelines. That what really mattered in schools, for example, was the curriculum. In fact, the experts were even talking about teacher proof curricula to get that messy human element out of the way. And now we're starting to see over and over again that connection is king. There's a new study of superagers that came out last week and was reported in the New York Times, which showed that the people who lived the longest, were happiest, were people who had these deep ties. I think that's really what I've been focused on in my own life and organizational life. I'm so grateful to work in an organization where people love each other. We really work with each other and we care about each other. That's a precious thing. So I think I will go with "Only connect" as the adage to characterize what I've been trying to do.
Mark, thank you. You've been an inspiration to me for many years now, and, I think everybody should check out the cogenerate.org website, as well as Mark's books. One of my favorites of Mark's is, How to Live Forever, and is not a longevity book. It's not about Brian Johnson in Venice Beach who's not gonna die. It is about how to have an influence that will last forever because it's generational. So, thank you, Mark.
Thank you so much, Chip. It's always a joy to talk.
I am so excited to be teaching with Mark this fall. I hope that you got a little bit of a flavor for what we're going to talk about, and both the practical side, but also the sort of broader perspective on, where we are as a society around aging. One of my favorite questions I ask when I give big speeches is, I ask people to make a list of the 5 people in their life that they feel most intimately connected to, but none of them can be family members. It has to be friends. friends or work associates. And so people make their lists of 5. Then I say, write down the age of each one of them. And then I ask, the people in the audience, what percentage of these 5, how many of these 5 are at least 10 years older or 10 years younger than you? And on average, about 1 out of the 5 are. So 80% of our close friends and peers are people who are pretty much our same age. And only 20% are outside of that band. And that's something we need to work on because, frankly, in a society in which more and more power in companies is moving to younger people, we need to learn how to actually collaborative in how we work together and how we live together even. So if I had 3 key takeaways from this talk with Marc, they were about halfway through the episode. He talked about 3 particular practical steps you can take. Number 1 is if you're in mid-career and midlife, let's say you're around 50 years old, find a way to take a gap year or a sabbatical or at least some extended period of time for you to reimagine what's next for you. Mary Catherine Bateson called that the midlife atrium. And I have to tell you, for me, when I sold my company at 49, almost 50, I had 2 years of really being able to sort of explore things. Now, not everybody has that. And I think society needs to figure out ways to make it more affordable for people to take off at least a month to be able to have your brain rewired and to actually change your habitat. It's hard to change your habits when you don't change your habitat. This is part of the reason why I think MEA is so necessary. Number 2 is, how do you find a place that has a structured content and context for you to reimagine what's next for yourself? The Encore Fellowship program is something that Marc started, and you can just Google Encore Fellowships and you can see more about that. There are all kinds of other programs out there where older people can actually have a structured context to be a mentor and an intern at the same time. And MEA obviously is another place where you can come and learn about this. And, the structured context of our workshop in November is a great catapult or catalyst for you to imagine how do you want to curate the second half of your adult life. And then finally, Marc spoke to the idea that no matter what you do, you're going to have spaciousness. Great. You're going to have a structured context for deciding how do you want to apply this, your gifts that you've learned along the way, but do it intergenerationally. That's almost a requirement. And the reason for that is because, as Eric Erickson talked about with his generativity theme, when we actually are giving something back to future generations, in the past, we could know that we were actually keeping the species going well. But today, it's even more important because you're getting something as well. When I was actually working quite closely with the Airbnb founders, what I learned was I was learning as much from them as they were from me. They learned from emotional intelligence from me. I learned some digital intelligence from them. And we were both better off for it. I hope to see you in November because, quite frankly, this is one of my most exciting workshops of the year. I wrote a book called Wisdom at Work, The Making of a Modern Elder. That will be a core part of the workshop as well as Marc's most recent book, How to Live Forever. See you in Santa Fe in November.
Thanks for listening to the Midlife Chrysalis. This show is produced by Midlife Media. If you enjoyed this episode, help us spread the word by subscribing and leaving a review on your favorite platform.